Welcome to Flipping the Table. In this lively episode, Michael Dimick engages in a friendly and enlightening sparring with author Michael Grunwald over his new book, We Are Eating the Earth, The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate. Their exploration accepts the complex realities and still identifies where organic, regenerative, and industrial approaches to agriculture might actually meet to ensure we don't cook the world while we try to feed it. Enjoy the show.
Years ago, the nation's poet, novelist, essayist, and philosopher-farmer Wendell Berry wrote that eating is an agricultural act. Well, with time, that framing has morphed. Now many of us see and know that eating is a political act. Consequently, the views on the future of the food system are like our politics, very polarized. On one side, you have the conviction that bigger is better. Factory farming is the right approach because we've got to feed the people as cheaply as possible. On the other hand, people like me believe that an agriculture that is as closely integrated with nature as possible must be the future, meaning non-toxic, biodiverse, multi-scaled, not so ecologically and economically extractive of rural communities, and equitable to all the workers in the supply chain from field to table. I happen to believe, and so do many people that I'm speaking with these days, think that the polarization in this field is hurting us. Rigid belief, a sense that I know better than you, is an act of hubris when the facts reveal that all sides have much to learn about the complexity of nature, the complexity of trying to produce food without eating the earth. And this is where we connect with my guest today, the best-selling author and investigative journalist, Michael Grunwald. His new book is out, and it's titled, We Are Eating the Earth, The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate. It is a provocative title with which I find much to embrace. But back to this idea of polarization. I first became aware of Michael Grunwald back in December of 2024 when he published a guest essay in the New York Times that set many people in my world on fire. They were outraged and pissed. The piece was titled, Sorry, but This is the Future of Food. He seemed to argue that industrial agriculture and factory farms, not regenerative agriculture, was the correct path to feed the world. As an advocate for regenerative agriculture, particularly in livestock, I too was incensed. So when he arrived in Berkeley this past April to debate a renowned UC Berkeley researcher on the concept of greening factory farms, I had to go. In my view, Michael clearly out-debated the Berkeley professor, and I was disappointed. The event had missed the mark and seemed to continue this polarization, and it missed some critical points of synthesis. Luckily, Michael was staying in the same hotel, and I had a chance to connect with him for a few minutes, and I invited him to this podcast. His publisher sent me the book, and I devoured it. One of my favorite things about the book is that at the front he includes a quote from the early 20th century satirist and curmudgeon, H.L. Mencken. And I quote, For every complex human problem, there is a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong. Some of those clear and simple solutions we hear offered today are that we need to stop eating meat, or that big agriculture is bad agriculture, or that all genetic modifications in food are bad, or that agriculture will recapture all the excess carbon in the atmosphere and save the world. Well, reality is more complex than that. And today, Michael Grunwald and I will try to find some sweet spots where all the different approaches, whether organic, regenerative, or even industrial, have some things to contribute in solving this extremely wicked problem of feeding the world without destroying it. As Michael points out in his book, Finding the sweet spot may not be as, quote, inspiring as a holy war against industrial agriculture, carnivores, or capitalism. But at least it recognizes the wisdom of H.L. Mencken, who warned us to be very curious about what folks are selling us to solve complex problems, particularly when there is money involved. So let's begin. Michael Grunwald, great to have you. Really glad to have you on Flipping the Table.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I always like to start with the origin story. So why don't you tell us how you came to this work as an investigative journalist and an author, and then this particular book, why we are eating the earth, the race to fix our food system and save our climate.
Sure. Well, I've been a policy reporter for 30 years. I was at the Washington Post, I was at Time Magazine, and then I was at Politico magazine. And while I was there, it was funny, I had wrote a lot about energy and climate, knew absolutely nothing about food and climate. So much so that I'd written a magazine piece about my own life in the kind of new green economy. I'd gotten solar panels on my roof. I had a electric Chevy Bolt. And I had this throwaway line about how, I'm not some eco saint. I don't unplug my computer at night. I don't line dry my laundry. I still eat meat. But I was this kind of eco mercenary. I had learned that going green was really going to save me a lot of money. And that made me think that this was going to become a kind of mainstream thing, which turned out to be correct. But when I was going back and doing I was just going over the fact checking, I realized, like, wait a minute. Is eating meat even bad for the climate? I literally had no idea. So I called this guy I had known for a long time, one of the smartest people I knew in Washington, this guy named Tim Searchinger, he had been a wetlands lawyer, and I knew he was working on some agriculture and climate stuff. So I called him and I said, Tim, is meat really that bad for the climate? And he said, yes. And then he said, duh, because Tim's he doesn't really suffer fools gladly, and he clearly thought I was one at that point. But what I realized is that, I wrote about energy and climate, and I didn't know about the food problem, and it's a third of the climate problem. It's an even larger percentage of our water pollution and water shortages and biodiversity problems. And that's really what set me on this journey to say, like, hey, if I don't know about this, and probably other people don't. It's a really big problem. There are a million books about energy. Why don't I try to figure out what's happening with food?
Uh-huh. And when you say food is a third of the problem, you mean the food system as a whole. That's everything from the field to the table and all the transportation, everything.
Exactly. Agriculture is probably a quarter of the climate, of our emissions. But the food system writ large is about a third.
Yeah. And, it's so funny. One of the challenges is finding good data. Because as I read your book, I was on the internet. I probably spent 40 hours reading this book, reviewing this book, and doing research for this conversation. And I have to say that the spectrum or the array of data that flows in is unbelievable. I mean, the IPCC reports have changed. Livestock's long shadow has changed. I mean, right from the beginning, what you realize is there's a lot more research to be done to understand the complexity that we're facing with the food system.
Well, that's certainly true. And, if I can put in a plug, I realized that I was taking on this giant undertaking. I interviewed a couple thousand people, God knows how many reports and books I've read about this stuff. But I really wanted to make this a narrative. I wanted this to be, I didn't want to just write the data and write the science. I wanted people to understand it and get it into their bones. So I think, in some ways it's extremely complicated, but I also tried to focus on, there are some pretty clear takeaways that, the number one being we are eating the earth, that 2 of every 5 acres on this planet is now, being used as crops or pastures, which I think most of us don't think about, except maybe when we're taking a cross-country flight and see all those squares and circles out the window. This used to be a natural planet, and it's becoming an agricultural planet, and that's really at the root of a lot of the problems that I write about.
Yeah. And so that you kind of just encapsulated what your argument is, that we have to change because we're using too much land, and that to avoid basically destroying the climate and feeding the planet, we have to change the way we produce food.
That's right. I mean, I always say it's a book about how we can feed the world without frying the world. But the sort of dirty secret is that we know how to feed the world. Obviously not perfectly. And there are hungry people on Earth, and, food insecurity is a real problem. But in general, when there's demand for food, we're pretty good at making it. And if we have to, we'll cut down more forests and drain more wetlands and make more of it. The fact is, we're going to have to make about 50% more protein and calories by 2050, and we really can't keep using more land. And we are going to have to reduce our agricultural emissions probably 75-80%. Look, we need agriculture, we need to eat, but it's going to have to make much less of a mess, and it's going to have a smaller agricultural footprint, because otherwise, we're going to blow past 2 degrees Celsius, even if we all stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of assumptions I want to get into here because this is really critical. The first is that the book rests on the idea that we're going to have 10 billion people on the earth, and that we need to feed them well by the end of the century. This is one of the places where I really started to look, and you even point to it in the book, that the population is not growing as fast as we thought. The latest piece I found was from the University of Washington Medical School, which said, it surprised me. It said that by the end of the century, we could be down to 7 billion people, which is what Elon Musk is saying. Yeah, and I'm not saying that he's right. I'm just saying that over half the planet now, half the countries on the planet are below the 2.1 we need for replacement. Yes. You point that on your book. Searchinger says it even in the book. You quote him. So the question is, number one, I want you to explain why you're working with 10 billion as the number, and then second thing I want you to talk about in your assumptions, because this is really important, and you said it, that agriculture we have to reduce our footprint of emissions from agriculture by 75%. When we know that fossil fuels are 90% of emissions, and about the same amount as methane emissions, according to what I just saw last night on the internet, as agriculture. Fossil fuels puts out as much emissions in methane as agriculture. So why are we focused on agriculture when the biggest problem is fossil fuels?
All right. Well, let me take those two questions a little separately. Well, first, I think we're focused on fossil fuels, right? 97% of climate finance right now is headed towards the energy sector, and only 3% is headed towards food and agriculture. And I like to say that probably about 1% of the climate conversation is about food and agriculture. And the thing is that with energy, obviously, it's a huge problem. Don't get me wrong, and it's a bigger problem than food and agriculture. But first of all, it's about 25 years ahead. When I started my career, there were no alternatives to fossil fuels, but now there's a clean energy revolution happening. With energy emissions may be peaking. We're certainly making progress on it, and in any case, we know what to do about it. Right? We, basically we need to electrify the global economy and run as much as possible on clean electricity. And like I said, we're making progress, not nearly enough, not nearly fast enough, but we know how that story ends. We just don't know when it ends. Now, food and ag, That we don't even know what to do. We haven't even started grappling with that question. And my book is really an effort to grapple. So that's sort of why food and ag for me. And I'm not saying don't worry about fossil fuels. I'm saying like, hey, here's this other third of the problem that is also an even bigger part of other environmental problems that we need to focus on that too. All right, now population.
Yeah, let's talk about population, because isn't that the underlying problem?
So that's part of the problem. Now, what I would say, and I never say that we're going to, what I say in the book is that we're heading towards almost 10 billion. And when I started working on it, the estimates for 2050, and I think 2050 is really important because that's when we talk about, we need to limit global temperatures to about 2 degrees of Celsius increase. That we have to, that we want to stop global warming, that we want to limit our emissions. The 2050 timeframe is really what people are looking at. I mean, looking beyond that, I mean, who knows what the technologies are going to be, what the Earth is going to look like, but that's really the kind of focus. And when I started, it looked like maybe 9.7, 9.8 billion by 2050. Now the projections are maybe 9.5 billion. So there has been a little bit of a decrease, mostly because in the rich world, and as you say, I write about this, because of we've started educating girls. We've reduced infant mortality in much of the developing world, and when you don't have to have 7 kids to make sure that 3 survive, that changes birth rates. So there really has been some progress there, and population growth is definitely leveling off, just about everywhere except for sub-Saharan Africa. That said, by 2050, it won't make that much of a difference, emissions-wise and even numbers-wise. And the reason is because of all that, population growth in the past and high birth rates in the past, that there are an extraordinarily large number of child-rearing age women. So that even if birth rates are reduced, there's still going to be a lot of babies. Again, I want to point out that, when these projections of how much food we're going to need are not entirely just, how many people we're going to have. But the fact is we're going to have a lot of people by 2050. Will it be 9.8 billion? Will it be 9.5 billion? That's not clear. But, even these reductions in population growth have only reduced the kind of emissions projections by maybe 4 or 5%.
Yeah, it's interesting. University of Washington is saying by 2064, there'll be 9.7 billion, and by 2100, 8.8 billion. I thought that was interesting. That's really showing
Right.
A lower number. And I absolutely agree with you on this, that between now and 2050 is the critical moment. And this is going to get us later into this whole idea of carbon sequestration and the as you quote Scherzinger, that carbon farming is bullshit. I thought that was a powerful statement on his part about that. So let's move on to this idea of your argument. And the first time I came across you was really when you wrote your December 2024 piece in the New York Times. Really amazing article. Set my world on fire. All my friends were pissed off. It was great. It's been a big conversation. And that's why I went to Berkeley to see you, because I had to see your conversation and then read the book. Your basic argument on the surface is that we need industrial agriculture. And I want you to just talk about what you mean.
Well, what I would say is that we need high yield agriculture. The problems I talk about, which are essentially that we need more food and we need to use less land, and we need to have fewer emissions. That means we need to cut down fewer trees and drain fewer wetlands, and we need to make more food from a smaller area. So that means higher yields. We need to make more food per acre so that we use fewer acres to make food. So I try not to just say like, hey, that means industrial agriculture. Because I'm honestly like, I feel like a lot of these food issues and ag issues have become kind of ideological when I'm more mathematical. If you can come up with, if organic agriculture can come up with ways to overcome the current yield drag that most organic farms have, that's awesome. And I actually went to Brazil and I wrote about some some ranches where they used a lot of regenerative practices, where they had rotational grazing, where they integrated the cattle with their crops, where they
Fazenda Tropical.
yeah, where they did no-till, where they did cover crops, and these guys they hadn't read Michael Pollan, they weren't like singing, folk songs about soil health. These guys were just all they cared about was their yield and their soil, and they had spectacular yields. Now they used a lot of industrial practices too. They had feedlots. They were fertilizing their pastures, so it wasn't like they were, so there was plenty for Michael Pollan to be upset about. But in any case, I certainly was not saying like, oh, this is terrible, they're doing regenerative practices and that can't feed the world. Those guys were feeding the world, and more power to them. What I would say is that, the factory farms that everybody hate, and as you saw at Berkeley, I'm not defending a lot of the things that people hate about them, right? They treat animals badly. They treat people badly. Often their politics are, basically climate denialist. They use too many antibiotics that are creating a public health crisis. They might be pandemic risks. There's a lot not to like. But one thing that factories are good at is manufacturing lots of stuff. And today's industrial agriculture does make a lot of food, and we are going to need to make a lot of food. I know everybody hates it when I bring up the Sri Lanka example, because I know it was, it wasn't, they went cold turkey. They banned all agrochemicals. It was a pretty extreme measure, but you saw what happened, right? Yields crashed, the government fell, and everything went to hell. The fact is that some of the things that people don't like about so-called industrial or agriculture or factory farms, their efficiency, they use fertilizers that help stuff grow. They use pesticides that kill pests that stop crops from growing. They do a lot, and efficiency has become this dirty word, right? It's like kind of rapacious corporations dredging dollars out of the dirt. But efficiency is really important because, that's what's going to save the Amazon, and that's what's going to save the Congo rainforest. And so I know I can sound like this kind of cold-blooded math guy, but I really do think this is a moral question, because climate change sucks, and hunger sucks. And so we need to make more food. We got to do it without chopping down all these trees. If there are alternatives to kind of high efficiency industrial agriculture that people don't like, that's great, but it's got to have high yields.
Yeah, I think that the question. So this gets into this whole idea of definitions. You and I, before we started, talked a little bit about the fact that there's this idea of industrial ag, regenerative ag, or big ag. And none of those really are very useful because they don't get at the reality, the nuance that you have to get to understand the real complexity of how to do it right. And I actually don't have a problem at all, and I've said this many times. My last podcast was with a very large farmer, 30,000 acres in California, the Central Valley, who I think you would be the kind of farmer you would like, because he's really focused on his soil. He's got some crop diversity going on. And I really think that is the issue about industrial, because the industrial mindset, if you look at a factory, what is the most important thing in a factory? You have to avoid any kind of diversity in the components. They have to all be the same. That goes against biological reality, because biology depends upon diversity in order to ensure that something survives, right, over time. The other problem with industry is it needs a quarterly return on profit. So when we put the overlay of industrial agriculture, the idea of industrial agriculture, and we don't focus on those two problems with it, we get into real problems. All the environmental problems you described, all the human problems, all the social problems come from quarterly return on investment and the elimination of diversity in the agricultural system. So when you talk about what I like, the idea of efficiency, what do we mean by efficiency? And what's the timeline? So yes, we have to produce more food per acre. We have to. But what is the cost, and where do you find the sweet spot? That is the challenge that we're living with.
I think that's a great point. And one of the I tried to bang my spoon on my high chair a little bit about this idea that that these kind of two camps can learn from each other, right? That there are regenerative practices that can maybe help with high yields, and then or that can help industrial farms protect their soil from erosion. And there are industrial practices that can help regenerative and organic farms get better yield. And I think that's all important. One area I would push back a little bit is on this idea of kind of that that farms should be natural, and there are definitely benefits to diversity. But one thing I do, really keep pointing out, and people do hate this, but the real diversity was nature. Right. Yes. When those, we wag our fingers at Brazil and Indonesia and say it's terrible. You're, deforesting your land, to grow soy or palm oil or have these cattle ranches. While in the United States, we have very little deforestation. We're not draining our wetlands. Well, yeah, that's because we did it in the 19th century, right? Right. Indiana was 85% forests, yep. And now it's all corn and soybeans. Yep. And like those guys, it's great. They're very efficient corn and soybeans farmers, but so are the guys in Brazil. And there's not a moral difference between what they're doing. Right. I do think, look, Michael Pollan is a beautiful writer. I wish I had his lyrical style. And he's an incredibly smart guy. But I do think there's been this somewhat pernicious kind of valorization and romanticization and kind of nostalgia for these kind of old style farms that were very diverse. And certainly they weren't monocultures that were bombed with chemicals. But the idea is that there was something noble about these bucolic, rustic farms that really didn't make very much food. And the fact is, there was an environmental cost in transforming these, smaller, more diverse, more natural, kinder and gentler farms into these, massive monoculture factory farms. There's no doubt about that. But the real cost was, the real environmental damage happened when the prairie or the forests were transformed into those bucolic, rustic Michael Pollan farms. That's where the real environmental damage happened. And that's why today, when we talk about sustainable intensification, and people don't like this idea of intensification, of increasing yields, of, kind of dredging more food out of a particular swath of land. But when you do that, that means that you don't need more land. You don't have to clear more forests. You don't have to drain more wetlands. You don't have to eat more of the earth. And that, I think, is really important and often
that is
gets
the
lost.
Key.
Yeah. And I think that's gotten lost a little bit. And like you saw, like Alice Waters was sitting in the third row when I was talking at Berkeley, and she was glaring at me the whole time because she thinks, she has a certain vision that, farms should be more like gardens. And that works great if you're charging $300 a plate at Chez Panisse, but I don't think that's going to feed the world.
Right. I do eat at Chez Panisse once in a while. It's never $300 a plate, but I will say, I will say this. I will say this. So this is the whole problem we face in the country now. Everything is polarized. And that does not help us, because what we really need to do is get out of the polarization and get to solving the problem. And I want to move to that now, because you come up, the book, you use Tim Sershinger as this kind of backbone for the book, because the guy is unbelievable. He is pursuing facts incessantly. He's obsessed, as you describe it, and it's really cool because he is searching, and you end the book with him kind of seeing some of the solutions. So I want to move into that, because I think that the solutions you talk about are interesting. You mentioned a couple of times now this Fazenda Tropical, if I'm saying it correctly, which is this incredible place down in Brazil. Used to be rainforest, is now a very large, very efficient farm that uses a combination of what you would call regenerative practices and industrial practices. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Dirk Rice, this guy you mentioned seaweed, you mentioned desmodium, this purple clover, moringa, the pivot biofertilizer enhancement. I thought that was fucking fascinating. CRISPR, big data, and then I want to end kind of when we start talking about livestock, because I got some interesting thoughts there I want to share with you. But talk about solutions that you see emerging.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first, and you've kind of hinted at this, is that we're going to need a lot of them, right? This is going to be really hard. And I talk to people all the time who are like, well, if everybody just went vegan, we wouldn't have a problem. And it's like, yeah. So what's your plan for everybody to go vegan?
Right.
Or if we just, and it's true, like the world wastes a quarter of its food. We shouldn't do that. That means we waste a quarter of the farmland we use to grow the food and the water and the fertilizer, and that's very bad. But it's going to be even harder to. Nobody's done it yet, right? And
veganism is not going to do it because
right.
You show the data on that.
Yeah, right. I mean, with my larger point is that even if we, the rich world ate 50% less beef, and beef is like 10 times as bad for the climate and the planet as chicken and pork. So it really is a ruminant meat problem. But even if we somehow, cut that in half, and the world cut food waste in half, and we stopped using biofuels, which is a tremendous waste of good farmland, we would still need to make a lot more food with a lot less land. So that's where I start with from these, that we're going to have to do all the things, or at least most of the things. Beef is really where you kind of want to start, right? It's like just like Willie Sutton said that, why did he rob banks? And it's because that's where the money is. If you want to do something about agricultural emissions, you got to start with beef because that's where the emissions are. And so that I do think on the demand side, we've had over the last 50 years, per capita, we eat about a third less beef and a lot more chicken, which sucks for the chickens.
But say that again, because I think that's really important, because in your book, it starts out with Sturgeon saying, we're never going to change the way people eat. But then you've already shown in the book that we're eating a third less beef.
That's right. And it would be, so just think how bad our climate problems would be if that shift hadn't happened. I say in the book that it's, until the rise of solar, that kind of inadvertent shift, and it was just because chicken got cheap and people consider it healthier, because of that modest shift from beef towards chicken, that's done more to help the climate than any other shift that humans have made in the last 50 years before the rise of solar. So yes, I do think that's possible. And I've seen, it's really hard to get people to change behaviors. I mean, you can use public policy, but I quote this pollster who told me that, kind of restrictions on meat or taxes on meat are the least popular public policy he has ever surveyed. He said it's like veterans benefits for ISIS. So, I don't have a lot of faith in that. And look, I mean, vegans have been yelling at people that meat is murder for a long time. There's been a lot of education about how cruel factory farms can be. We still eat more meat every year. I have seen a little bit of, I wrote about in the New York City hospitals, they're kind of using nudges. They use plants by default, where they offer patients plant-based meals. And if they don't want that, they offer another plant-based meal. And only if they turn those two down do they offer meat. And the percentage of vegan meals or vegetarian meals have gone from 1% to 51% in just a couple years. So it shows that behavior is changeable. It's just hard.
That's not
I'm
behavior
very,
change, though. That's taking someone's choices away. That's not really
no,
behavior
it's
change.
they still have the choice. It's kind of a choice architecture, right? You
Okay.
can still get meat if you demand it. But look. I mean, I think I'm still excited about the possibility of meat alternatives, meat substitutes. The plant-based experiment is not going very well.
Disaster from your book. I mean,
I think
number of money that's been lost. I mean, it's incredible how I was really, I actually was. There was a lot of stuff I didn't know about all these different companies you described that have totally blown up that were in alternative
it's
meat.
well, I think I mean, some people say like this just shows it'll never work. What I say is it'll show it won't work if it's doesn't taste as good and it's not as cheap as real meat, and that's going to be hard. And I do think, but look, I mean, it took solar 50, 60 years to take off, and it took hundreds of billions of dollars of public and private investment. That hasn't happened yet with fake meat or cultivated meat from real cells or meat from fungi. I think there are a lot of still exciting options. Yeah, and you've seen like plant-based milks are now a really legitimate probably 10-15% of the market. So I think I think again change is possible, but that's all on the demand side. There's also going to have to be changes on the agricultural side, on the supply side. And there, as you said, I'm excited about a lot of different technologies from, you mentioned Pivot Bio.
Yeah, talk about that. I think people should know about that because one of the things that you point out, and this gets skipped over a lot of the emissions have to do with the fact that 50% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that are put into soil end up in water or in the air. That's
Right.
overlooked
Right.
all the time. And to me, that's as big as cattle in many ways. That is a huge thing because Haber-Bosch, we would not have, and you pointed out in the book, we would not have as many people on this planet if we had not produced if it back at what was it 1908 Haber-Bosch was industrialized for the First World War. You didn't point that out. That's another book that points that
Yeah,
out.
no,
That's a
Alchemy of
huge
Air. It's a
fucking
great book.
problem, Haber-Bosch.
It actually is. Though again, like livestock's probably 15% of our climate problem. Fertilizer, really big problem. I would say it's about 2.5% of our global problem, though 10% of our agricultural problem. So
Yeah,
it's a really
yeah,
big deal. Though, and like you say, we waste half of our fertilizer.
right.
Although it's a little bit like advertising, right? We know that half of it's wasted. The question is, how do you figure out which half?
Well, you point
It's
out Pivot Bio, though, is one of the things because also for capturing carbon, you need more nitrogen. So you got to talk
exactly.
about that.
So sure. So Pivot Bio is the 20th century. I'm not somebody who craps on the green revolution, right? Because since the invention of these fertilizers, these improved crop genetics, improved livestock genetics, large scale irrigation, all this stuff that people today kind of think of as industrial agriculture, and some of it has made a mess, but it's tripled crop and livestock yields. So we'd be using 3 times as much land if we hadn't had it. But that said, it was mostly a chemical revolution, and I think there's a real feeling that the 21st century we could have a greener green revolution that's more biological. And I
Yes.
use Pivot as a real example where basically what they've done is they genetically edit some microbes that naturally fix nitrogen from the air, so that you don't have to make it out of natural gas, like they do with fertilizer. But these microbes take nitrogen out of the air and feed it to crops. And of course, this is actually what these microbes do naturally, but there's so much nitrogen in these farm soils from fertilizer that the microbes have kind of gone lazy and gone to sleep, and the editing kind of turns off their nose that sniffs out that there's a lot of nitrogen already. But
That's
anyway,
CRISPR editing, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's to me it's very exciting. Now, right now, Pivot Bio is on 5 million acres of U.S. corn, so it's like more than 5%. So it's becoming a real thing, and they replace about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is about 1/5 of the of the nitrogen load. So again, we're still talking about like 1% of 1% of the nitrogen that we're pouring on our crops. But this is the kind of thing that if this takes off, this could move the needle. And I write about a similar biological replacement for chemistry, this biopesticide. That I love because it uses the mRNA technology behind those COVID vaccines. But instead, what it does is it constipates potato beetles to death. And again, like potato beetles are, potatoes are not as big a crop as corn or soy or rice worldwide, or wheat. But look, if you can replace a lot of chemicals and you can reduce a lot of emissions. So I do think those kind of I visited the University of Illinois where they're using gene editing and supercomputers to try to reinvent photosynthesis. Which sounds crazy, right? Because photosynthesis has been doing a pretty good job of maintaining life on Earth for a couple billion years. But like Searchinger says, it was invented a few billion years ago by blue-green algae that weren't all that smart. And it turns out to have a lot of inefficiencies in it that they are editing out. And in 20 years, you could have crops that are 50% more efficient because of their better use of photosynthesis. So I just think there are all kinds of really smart people working on these really exciting solutions. I do have to point out, none of them really have any traction yet. Unlike energy, we've really just started, dealing with this problem. But I think we've got to throw a lot of money into research. Then we're going to have to throw a lot of money into deploying the solutions that work. And even if we do that, it's still going to be a really hard problem to solve.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I wanted to get to this, the idea of research. And we're living in a moment when research is being cut and all the researchers are being fired. I just had to let go of a colleague from a project because all his money's being cut at UC Davis. I mean, it's a freaking nightmare what's going on. And that's exactly what we don't need at this moment. Also, the ramp up of fossil fuels in the country is, counter to this idea that we're gaining ground on the energy problem of fossil fuels. So I want to get to this problem of cattle, and I want to talk about a couple of assumptions that I think are really important. And I know it's absolutely true that beef cattle, particularly, or beef and dairy cattle, are big animals. They take a lot of water, they eat a lot of food, and they do have enteric emissions. They do release methane. Here's the challenge that I have with this whole problem. One is that in the book you argue that half the ag land in the world is used by animals for livestock, but that doesn't really mean that
3/4.
Yeah, if we got rid of those, that livestock, that would not mean we could produce crops on that land, because a lot of that land here in California, for instance, where I live, you could not grow crops on that land that those animals are living on.
Well, let me start by saying 40% of the world's grazing land was once forest. So it's true. Not all grazing land would be awesome, awesome for crops. But you could grow a lot of stuff on a lot of it, including trees. So there is a gigantic
which is one of the
opportunity
things we didn't talk about, silvopasture, as a way, as an approach that
I do talk about it. I love it.
So in the book, you haven't here verbally, but on the book, you talk a lot about it. It's one of the great solutions. And you said it actually when I met you after the Berkeley talk, you talked about silvopasture. So it's a great, and that people are talking about it. It's being adopted in a larger scale, certainly in Africa than I've seen around here, which is a really interesting solution. But so yes, I agree. For instance, the Midwest, we could be growing a lot more diverse crops in the Midwest, and we don't have to be growing all those corn and soy for animals, for livestock. We could be growing other things. Now, you have a much shorter season. You also have a lot of drought. the New Deal in the 1930s, not your book, The New Deal, but the 1930s New Deal, what happened? Why did that happen? That happened because they had a 10-year drought. They had terrible farming methodologies, and they had a huge wind event during a depression. And what you got was a farm bill that tried to take that problem on. Because in the Midwest, we destroyed the natural environment. Totally agree with you. Big problem. You could not recreate a California type agriculture in the Midwest.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned the Dust Bowl, because one thing, when people always yell at me about the Green Revolution, I always point out the Dust Bowl happened before the Green Revolution,
right?
Right. So it's not just like all these horrible industrial practices. It's not the only thing that's made farming tough.
That's right.
Look, I think. I sometimes when I talk about when I talk about beef, when I talk about that we're eating the earth, that we're using too much land, people say like, oh, don't you understand that we can't get rid of agriculture, we can't get rid of meat. What I'm really talking, and this was a theme in my last book that you just mentioned about Obama and the New Deal.
Right.
Better is better than worse.
Right.
That perfect usually isn't on the menu.
Right.
Now beef, because beef is so much worse than chicken or pork, which are in turn worse than beans or lentil for the climate and the planet. But because beef is such an outlier, lamb too to some extent, it means that by reducing beef, we can really move the needle, and by improving beef, we can really move the needle, right? And those ranches I wrote about in Brazil, where if they're putting 10 times as many cows per acre on a ranch in Amazonia, they're using 1/10 as much of the Amazon, right? And that's a huge difference, and that's not just for the climate, but for the jaguars and macaws and the rest of the cast of Rio that relies on the Amazon. These are really, and for indigenous people living in the Amazon. So I do think some of the I do hear this a lot. It's like we need cows. They turn grass into human food in ways that when we can't eat the grass, and there is some truth to that. But there is but you gotta acknowledge the opportunity cost of all of this. This is one of the big messages of my book, is that land matters, that every acre is sacred, and that if you use it for grazing, that means it can't be used as for pure nature or in carbon storage. It can't be used for cropping. It can't be used for growing trees. Now, some of those acres can't be used for cropping and growing trees, and that's probably a more appropriate place to have cows, right? Because we're going to keep having some, and we're not just going to wipe them all out. But again, like all of this land, there's a lot of talk about marginal land. Oh, we can just grow biofuels on marginal land, but there isn't that much truly marginal land. Usually, if land that isn't that good at growing crops probably isn't that good at growing trees or growing biofuels either.
But it could be really good at growing grasses. Like you said, what you're talking about. See, so this is one thing I loved about your book. I can't remember, it's page 24 or something like. You had a great quote, and I think it's from Search Engine. You got it from H.L. Mencken. For every complex human problem, there's a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong. So,
Exactly.
So that I have to say this about the anti-meat thing, and I totally agree that we need less meat. We need better meat. That's my point.
Exactly.
That's meat. And this is the problem. Let me just finish with this.
Yeah.
I'm not finish the whole conversation, but finish on this piece of it. That cattle, hoofed animals, play a role in the natural environment. Grasses and animals co-evolved. They need each other. If you want to get back to nature and you want to turn nature, grasslands, into healthy environments, you need hoofed animals. So why do we not say this instead of let's get rid of all the meat? Let's say, let's create a system where you're using the animals to manage grasslands, which do hold carbon. And if you have nitrogen, and you talk about Will Harris, you talk about the ranches that have higher carbon because they use their animals' manure. I mean, why are we not doing that? Just instead of saying this simple thing, we got to get rid of all the animals.
Well, again, as you know, I'm not saying let's get rid of all the animals, but Will Harris's ranch is a good example, though. I mean, where they've got a bullshit, life cycle analysis claiming that they're actually reducing carbon, but that is just not true. And they say, like, Will Harris does have more carbon in his soil, but that's because he turned cropland into pasture land, and somewhere else somebody's replacing the crops, and he's producing, he says he's taking 3 times as much land to produce the same amount of food, and that is, that means 3 times as much deforestation, 3 times as much wetland conversion, and they don't account for that. And that, so again, I think there's a lot to what you're saying about this idea that grasslands and natural herbivores played a role on the plains, and there's going to be a role for all of that. But in general, grass-fed beef, that just stays on the pasture all their lives and doesn't go to a feedlot, is actually, the climate numbers are even worse than feedlot finished beef. And that's because it's less efficient, it uses more land, and they're alive longer, take longer to get to slaughter weight. And so they burp and fart more methane. These are hard questions. There are a lot of trade-offs. And again, I'm not just saying that there's going to be one size fits all answer, but I am again saying that, like, the land matters. That we can't, for too long, there's been this, this notion that, like, oh, well, if I'm using less fertilizer, then I'm better for the climate, even if I'm not making as much food. Or, if I'm not, if I have fewer cows, then I'm better for the climate, even though, it's less efficient. And this is what I'm really pushing back on. We have to look at how much food we're making, how much land we're using, how many emissions we're producing. And the answer, I'm not saying the answer is industrial or regenerative or, no-till or cover crops. I'm saying the answer is more food, less land, less mess. And anything that helps with that is awesome. And anything that stores carbon, whether it's planting trees and shrubs and pastures and fields, that's terrific. But the numbers matter. And I know the numbers sound boring sometimes. I tried to make them interesting. No, I think certainly the numbers can sound heartless. But at the other end of those numbers are hungry people, lost forests, drained wetlands, and stuff that really matters to the future of our species.
Yeah, well, the thing I appreciate about this book is it forces my world, all world, actually, whether you're industrial, regenerative, organic, it forces all of us to think about what reality is. Because the ideologies are what fucking killing the world, if you ask me. The ideologies. There's so many ideologies. People, it's like religion now.
Right.
What we really
like kiss the ground or common ground.
Right.
Right.
Which we're both, but here's the issue. Those are also countering what industry is saying. Industry is saying, so you need the tension, but you need all the different sides, but you can't get stuck on that. You got to let people get to the realities. And the realities are, we have a very big problem that requires a lot of research. But one of the things that I think at the end of the book that's really interesting is this idea, and going back to this model down in Brazil, they're cropping and they're using animals. They're intercropping, they're using animals in those systems. And that, I think, is the way we need to think. It needs to get more complex because nature is complex. When we had the natural world, which is what you described, that's when it worked. Humans came to the earth, and 10,000 years ago, we started creating agriculture. That messed up the system. But if there's humans, we're going to have to grow food. So the question is, how do we do it? I think we have to get a lot better about integrating natural systems and industrial systems and regenerative systems. We have to do a synthesis.
I think I think that's right. But I do, where I do push back a little bit, 'cause I don't want to create a difference between us, because I think we agree about the trade-offs and that all of these systems have things to learn from each other. I do think that this kind of the idea of natural farming has become an ideology too. Um,
I
and
didn't
look, I
say
mean,
natural farming, I said natural
yeah,
systems.
yeah, I mean, nature wasn't like the reason we invented agriculture 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago was because it was better at providing a lot of food for people.
Yeah.
Nature wasn't as good at that. And look, and from the beginning, agriculture made a mess. There's this idea that we can go back to this kind of pristine agriculture that
Never
was
existed.
kind of light on the land, and that was not true. I write about how actually the Anthropocene started with the invention of agriculture. That's when we really started transforming the land, and that
Right.
we had transformed a South America worth of forest into agricultural landscapes before the Industrial Revolution. So
Right.
again, not just industrial agriculture. But again, I think you see, and I mean, I just mentioned Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, and there's this whole Save the Soil movement, which is this. I think there's again this ideology that natural farming will kind of reverse global warming and save us all. And again, it sounds nice, but the science isn't there. Like we've talked about some ways that these regenerative practices can actually improve yields and can really help with the soil and do a lot of awesome things. But this notion that we're going to kind of repatriate all the carbon that we pumped up into the atmosphere and bring it back underground, there's just no evidence for it. And I really worry that already billions of dollars in these carbon markets are flowing into this kind of fallacy that we're going to just kind of, regenerative farm our way out of this, carbon farm our way out of it. And there are people talking about trillions of dollars of investments to try to basically transform all of global agriculture into these, kinder and gentler systems.
Well, you get to the big point actually right there that I think is not actually covered enough in the book and actually in the debate, and it's the control of the corporations. You start out in the book talking about Schlessinger's takedown around biofuels, which was really interesting, and the fact that that was basically corporations trying to manipulate the system. And the one thing that we haven't really talked about is that big agriculture or industrial agriculture is responsible for impoverishing the rural regions of the world. And that is not covered enough. It's the reason that we have Trump as the president, because we have destroyed the middle class, we have destroyed the rural regions of this country, and now we're having a pushback around that. And this is the problem because that has to be addressed. So let's do it better. Let's make a much more efficient agriculture. But how do we do that and not impoverish agrarian communities and rural regions?
Well, it's hard, is the sort of honest answer. Because one thing I do talk about a lot in the book, and it's almost kind of a backdrop for every chapter, is the just extraordinary power of the agricultural lobby,
Yeah.
right? And that's, this was an agrarian nation, and now only 1% of us farm, right? And it's true, we owe that 1% a huge debt, because that's what allows the rest of us to be, to run nonprofits or write books
Right.
or be
Right.
doctors and healers and bankers, and all the works. And so it's true. But the fact is, like, agriculture is extraordinarily powerful. They dominate agricultural policy in this country and a lot of other policies.
Yeah.
And that is true around the world. The world spends $600 billion every year on subsidies for agriculture. $300 billion of that is just direct handouts, and there are no strings attached for most of it. So part of what I'm saying is, like, you know, this is a little bit of a backdrop reality. The hope is that we can kind of have at least some kind of grand bargain where we try to get agriculture to make even more food and hopefully make even more money and make it more economically sustainable. But in exchange, it's going to have to make less of a mess. And it's going to be very difficult. I do tell the story of Denmark, though, right? Mm-hmm. Which, again, I know it's Denmark, right? They're the model nation. Everybody loves it there. It's, the women are beautiful and the people are nice and everything's great there. But they had, I went there in 2020. I remember it was February 2020 because when I got to the airport, when I was leaving, they asked me if I'd been in China. And I was like, why? And they were like, oh, there's some virus in China. I was like, what virus? So I know exactly what it was. But at the time, Searchinger was talking to the Danish agricultural industry. And what they were saying is, look, everybody's out to get us now. We always ran the politics here, but suddenly, basically, Denmark had already fixed most of its energy and climate problems. They had gone pretty much all renewable, and suddenly most of their emissions were coming from agriculture. And so it was their turn, they were next in the barrel. And they were like, okay, we've got to do something. The enviros were basically saying, let's get rid of Danish agriculture. Let's get rid of all our pigs and cows. And at the time, Searchinger was saying that makes no sense. You'll just outsource the pollution abroad, and they'll, and outsource the deforestation to less efficient countries. But the sort of long story short is that 5 years later, Denmark came up with a reform where they are going to help farmers be even more efficient and they're going to test all of these climate-friendly technologies, the alternative fertilizers and pesticides and, alternative crops and genetically edited, drought-tolerant crops, you name it. But they're also going to force farmers to give up 1 million acres of former wetlands and turn them back to wetlands. They're going to tax agricultural emissions. They're going to promote plant-based diets or at least plant-forward diets. And they're going to do all the things. And it really is, I think, a model for the world. Or at least it's a way of saying hey, it's not impossible. It's hard, but, better public policy, it's a ambitious goal, but that ought to be the goal. And I don't think we should throw our hands up in the air and say these guys are too powerful, screw it, we're never going to change anything. Or maybe my little patch of land, I'm just going to have, a beautiful little organic paradise. No, I think we really have to try to change the system. And, I don't think that involves being unrealistic about the political power behind the status quo. It just means fighting for change.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to end. I think that's a good message, an important message. So I support that. And I really thought your book was incredibly stimulating. I recommend all my colleagues in the good food movement read this book because it will make you think about what you're saying and how you're approaching it. So we are eating the earth, the race to fix our food system and save our climate by Michael Grunwald. Thank you, Michael. Real pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and keep up the good work you're doing.
Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.